Welcome back, everybody. So, today we're going to start looking at some political explanations for terrorism. So, in our last class, we focused and we started looking at the idea of how individual group explanations can account for why people might ultimately engage in a terrorist act. Today, we're going to look at some of the different ideologies that might drive and be behind individuals' willingness to engage in terrorism. And so we previewed this a little bit to some extent with our discussion of the ways of terrorism, but I just kind of wanted to go through some of the different political motivations that might be involved in an individual's willingness to engage in terrorism. And this will also start to preview some of the different organizations that we're going to talk about throughout the course. I'll always try to bring in groups and bring in a wide range of examples of different terrorists, of different ideologies, different places around the world. But today we'll just start to get a little bit of a preview into these different groups and their different motivations. So the first thing I want to start out with, first discussion question is, why do you think more? Why do you? Sorry, start over again. Discussion question one. Why don't you think more people in more groups use terror to achieve their political objectives? Again, discussion question one. Why don't you think more people or groups use terror to achieve their political objectives? Because we see terrorism occurs a lot of places around the world, but still, it's not the it's not a particularly what we call common tactic for individuals to engage in to achieve their political objectives. So just think about that when you're answering your question. So to think about the various terrorist motivations, we can think about the various political goals that they might have. We'll start with looking at traditional left-right political divides. We'll look at ecological terrorism. Think about ethno-nationalist terrorism, ethno-racially motivated terrorism, as well as religiously motivated terrorism. So let's just jump right into our first one of left-right terrorism. And this is probably what the political spectrum that most of you would be familiar with, that most political fights, especially in the United States, take place on is this left-right political divide. And we've seen terrorist attacks occur on the extremes of both sides of the political divide. The left-wing terrorists were particularly prominent in the 1970s, as we talked about, but since largely the 1980s and especially currently, right-wing terrorism has become much, much, much more of an issue and a problem, especially in the United States as compared to left-wing terrorism. And we just, giving the example here, we have the individual who drove his car into the crowd of counter protesters at the Charlottesville rally. We've seen incidents like the El Paso shooting a year or so ago. We saw Dylan Roof murder multiple people in the African American church in Charleston. So we've really seen a rise in right-wing terrorism. And we're going to dig a little bit more into especially right-wing terrorism and its growth in the United States when we look at domestic terrorism in a few lectures in the future. So we will dig into that a little bit more. But this is just, we can think of as some more traditional political fights that we have, but on the extremes can become the motivation for particular groups to engage in terrorist activities. But left-right is not the only political fights that individuals engage in, and is not the only reason at the extreme people are willing to carry out terrorist attacks. We can see it in other political motivations as well, such as ecological, environmental, green terrorism. And so these are individuals who really want to bring about attention to what they perceive as significant environmental issues, things like overwhaling, climate change, pollution, and they try to bring about attention to these issues through engaging in terrorist actions. We can see groups like the Environmental Liberation Front, Animal Liberation Front. These groups will try to engage in various acts to bring attention to their cause. But of all the types of terrorism that we're going to talk about today, this often results in the fewest deaths. These groups oftentimes are much more focused on property damage, they focus on, if they blow up buildings, things like that, they focus and really oftentimes try to ensure they're not killing anyone when no one's at particular locations, and they choose these particular symbolic targets in property to carry out these attacks rather than trying to focus on killing individuals. So this oftentimes is the least consequential, at least in terms of human life, of the type of terrorism that's actually carried out. And so we can see this, and also this probably, I would also say, is the least common form of terrorism of all the various types that we'll focus on today. But I think it's still important to bring up and mention, especially groups like ELF that have used tactics in the past to try to bring about attention to their political causes that are primarily environmental and ecological in origin. Next, we can also look at ethno-nationalist terrorists. And when we talk about ethno-nationalist terrorists, here we're focusing on we're largely focusing on groups that want to try and achieve independence from the particular state that they live inside. So a good example of this would be the Kurds. The Kurds are an ethnic group that live across multiple countries in the Middle East: Turkey, Iraq, Iran, parts of Armenia, Azerbaijan, parts of Syria. And this group doesn't have its own independent country. It's the largest ethnic group in the world that doesn't have its own independent country. And so one group that has been willing to engage in terrorist attacks to try to gain independence is the PKK. The PKK is a organization, a group of Kurds primarily in Turkey that want to gain, start to form an independent Kurdistan in parts of southeastern Turkey. And so they've been willing to engage in terrorist attacks in Turkey to try to force the government to grant them independence. We've also, in the past, we talked about the IRA. The IRA would be another example, Irish Republican Army, an example of an ethno-nationalist terrorist group. They want to have Northern Ireland break away from the United Kingdom and reunite with Ireland. We can see this in groups like the Tuaregs in northern Mali, and we'll talk about them as an example a little bit more in the future when we talk about secession and terrorism. But these groups are oftentimes have a sense of cultural, ethnic identity that doesn't necessarily align with the majority population of the state that their group lives within the boundaries of, and so they try to achieve their independence. And so these movements are interesting as well because they can oftentimes dissipate once their political objectives are achieved. If they gain independence from the state that they used to be, or the country they used to be part of, they oftentimes will then cease their terrorist activities. So these are, in an interesting way, their political motivations oftentimes can have more of a perceived endpoint in terms of when they're willing to stop engaging in terrorist acts, because if they achieve their objective of independence, they'll often then cease their terrorist activity. Then we also end up with ethno-racial terrorism, and this is some of the most pernicious forms of politically motivated terrorism that exists in the world. And this type of terrorism is really focused on either the elimination or submission of a particular ethnic racial group by another ethnic or racial group. And they oftentimes will use specifically targeted violence to try and achieve their objectives of the majority group, of instilling fear and terror in the minority group. And in this framework, we see terrorism primarily used as a tool of the oppressor, rather than what we would see perhaps more in an ethno-nationalist framework of the oppressed, with the minority group wanting to achieve independence. In this framework, we often see terrorism being used by the majority group to try and suppress or eliminate a minority group. So we can see this in groups like the Ku Klux Klan in the United States that has existed since after the Civil War, has largely engaged in terrorist attacks and activities, lynchings of African Americans, killing of African Americans, to try to instill fear and maintain a white racial supremacy. So we can see this particular type of ethnocentric, racially motivated terrorism really trying to suppress and eliminate particular groups. So this is a type of terrorism that we will focus on as well, and really has long-lasting consequences for these particular societies that these terrorist acts are carried out in. It becomes extremely difficult, oftentimes, to overcome the consequences of these terrorist acts. We can still see this today with the consequences, not just the American South, but especially the American South, of the issues of white supremacy, and especially motivated by terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, in terms of the impact it's had on the society of these states in the American South. So this is something we really have to think about and take into consideration. And we'll think about this more as well when we look into domestic terrorism in the United States, to think about and get a better understanding of these particular groups and the consequences it's had on American society. And then finally, we want to look at religious terrorism. So we did talk about this a good amount when we looked at the waves of terrorism. We talked about it in our example of Aum Shinrikyo and their apocalyptic visions of the world and religious beliefs that drove them to ultimately engage in terrorist attacks. And these groups, as we've said, can be some of the most violent terrorist organizations in the world. They oftentimes have an ambition to execute attacks that are unconstrained in the scale of violence, kill as many people as possible, bring about the largest impact that they can, oftentimes for converting and bringing people to their cause, but also under the idea that the greater the scale of their attacks, the more likely that they are going to usher in the apocalypse, bring about the end of the world, and achieve their ultimate religious objectives. And we see this with groups like ISIS. We see this with groups like Army of God in the United States. So we really have to take into consideration these particular religious organizations. So while we started talking about this some, I do want to make this a discussion question, see where you can take this idea. But why do you think religious terrorists may often be the most violent? I know we talked about this issue of the apocalypse, things like that, but try to think outside the box to try to get to why you think also religious terrorists might ultimately be the most violent compared to some of these other political motivations that we've talked about with behind certain terrorist attacks. So I'll leave it there for now. It's a little bit shorter today, but we'll have a follow-up case study where we're going to be looking in particular at ISIS, and we'll dig a little bit more into the Islamic State. So leave it there for now. I'll talk to you again soon.